All right. So, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining our CSP webinar. Our session today is going to be on controlling app access. So, I'm going to be talking about a couple ways that we can build upon all of the other content that we've discussed as part of our webinar series on the identity and devices, and how we're now going to look at the apps themselves. So, as with our raise your hand if you guys don't mind monitoring the chat for me while I'm speaking. That would be great in case anyone puts any questions into the chat window. All right, so let's get started here. So as I had mentioned, we've had some previous sessions, and they're all on the recorded website or the recordings website. And I'll have the link here at the end of the presentation here on how to get to those. But we talked about the identity, security at the identity level, looking at devices, and there's a lot that went into those two topics. Um, but what we're doing now is we're building on as we look at the complete security posture. We're going to look at how do we start using some of the cloud security controls that we have and start applying those to the applications directly. And one of the main components of when we start talking apps is actually Azure AD single sign-on. And that might seem a little strange. Why is single sign-on so important? Uh, but ultimately, single sign-on provides us transparent security for the end users. When users are getting prompted for usernames and passwords all of the time, it becomes habit. It becomes second nature for them to just type in their password and say, okay, log in. And what happens is the users get so accustomed to that when they get prompted by a malicious website or a phishing website or something like that, it's just habit. They go ahead and log in, giving away their credentials. So by having single sign-on in place, users start to get out of that habit, and it's going to take some time. It's not a switch we just flip, and all the users are now accustomed to never having to log in, except for when they log into their Windows workstation. But over time, they start to build that familiarity of saying, hey, I don't get prompted for credentials. So why am I getting prompted by this website? Or why am I being prompted by this app? That should trigger a little bit of a red flag for them. And then they can be, one, a little more cautious, or two, let the IT department know and say, hey, this doesn't really look good. Now, the statistics I have up on the screen are a little bit dated, but I think they still kind of drive home the point that single sign-on wants to bring. But the middle statistic here, passwords are duplicates. A lot of us, I'll admit, I use the same password for several things. But if you're using your password for your Gmail, for your Outlook.com, for your bank website, for your corporate login, if you're using the same password across all of those accounts, if someone compromises one of those passwords or one of those accounts, they essentially will try that password across all of the accounts they can find for you. So it might not be your corporate account that gets compromised first. It might be your personal Gmail account that gets compromised first, but then a bad actor will leverage that known password to try to compromise your corporate account. And hey, if it's the same password, look, I'm in. Um, so you might think, well, if all the passwords are the same, doesn't single sign-on kind of do the same thing there? If I log in using one password to everything with single sign-on, what benefit does that provide me? And it's a really good point, but what we're going to focus on is how do we control the Azure identity, which is leveraged to sign into all of those third-party apps as well. So we have additional security controls at the Azure level. We've talked about multi-factor. We've talked about conditional access. We've talked about device trust on leveraging only trusted devices or compliant devices. These are all security controls that make Azure authentication a lot more secure than maybe just logging into Gmail directly, which might be just set up for a simple username and password. So that's where single sign-on still provides value, is because we can leverage all those cloud security controls outside of Microsoft as well. Oops, I hit the wrong button there. There we go, finally. All right, so what I was just talking about is leveraging all the cloud security. So maybe I jumped ahead of my slides a little bit here, but when we talk about Azure AD single sign-on, Azure AD becomes our source of identity. Um, we do pull in all of those different security controls. So all those things I just mentioned, we do get some of the benefits like using risk-based evaluation, device trust, and compliance. So we do have a lot more capability when Azure is our identity platform. But what's cool about this, and let me go to the next slide here, is we can look at all the Microsoft apps, all the Outlook or Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, OneDrive, Yammer, all those Microsoft apps. But reality is there's going to be some third-party cloud apps out there as well. Not everything's going to be made by Microsoft. What's great is Microsoft already has native single sign-on capabilities built in with over 3,000 apps that aren't Microsoft. So if you're talking about Dropbox and Salesforce and Workday, all of those are able to leverage Azure AD authentication, and they're quote unquote out of the box with Azure AD. So we have the ability to just really easily set that up to leverage our Azure AD security. We also have ability to look at apps that are custom built. So if we have a development shop and we're building our own app, we can tie in Azure AD authentication to our own apps as well. We can also tie into on-premise apps, third-party on-premise apps that we want to apply our Azure AD authentication to. So, the main thing here with our custom-built apps is you have to enable integration with certain authentication protocols. And then for on-premise, there's a tool called the App Proxy, and I'm going to go through all of that and actually up of it so you can take. All right, so we talked about the gallery apps, or I mentioned the gallery apps, and those are the third-party integrated apps that Microsoft has already done the integration with. Dropbox, Salesforce, Workday, even AWS. Believe it or not, you can do single sign-on to Azure Web Services if you want, or Amazon Web Services if you wanted to. But Microsoft has taken a lot of that brunt or that work on themselves to make these apps available in the gallery. And even when there is an app, let's say you stumble across a small third-party SaaS app and it's not in the gallery, Microsoft is actually pretty good at adding new apps all the time. So if you submit that app to Microsoft, you can submit it through Azure, a request or a help desk request or a support ticket through Azure. I think there's also a documented way you can do it through the Microsoft public website. But Microsoft's pretty good at working with those third parties and setting up native integration or making it a gallery app in Azure so you can just immediately start taking advantage of single sign-on. And that's mostly because the single sign-on supports some pretty well-defined standards on how it integrates with Azure. When you add an enterprise application, so if let's say you want to make Salesforce available with single sign-on, you add that application into your Azure AD tenant, and then it becomes available to the assigned user. So when the users go up to the little waffle icon on the top left of the browser, when they sign into Office 365, now Salesforce will be a listed app there that they can just navigate directly to from the Office 365 portal. And then there's some capabilities also. So you might be wondering, okay, let's set up Salesforce. Let's use Salesforce with Azure AD authentication. But how do I manage my users? If my identity source is Azure, that doesn't necessarily mean Salesforce is linked into my Azure AD directory for their services. So there's a capability for us to provision users into third-party services. So this is Azure pretty much saying, hey, go ahead and create John Smith. Here's his email. Here's his contact information. Here's all the relevant attributes that we need to use to populate a user in Salesforce. And it will go out and create that user. And it might even be able to assign the necessary role or permissions for that user within Salesforce based on criteria that we define. So Azure really can be more of your single point of operations when it comes to integrating or working with third-party applications. When we talk about on-premise applications, though, we do need to use a tool called the App Proxy, the Azure Active Directory App Proxy, AAD, if we all like acronyms. But you can think of this really as remote access as a service, because what that proxy connector does is it creates an outbound session from your internal network that talks to your application, but also talks to Azure. So we don't have to open up firewall ports. We don't have to open up any kind of special network routing for this to work. As long as the server that the app proxy connector runs on can talk to the internet over HTTPS, we can essentially publish all of our on-premise applications externally in a very secure fashion. The way that this works, though, there is some limitations. So you might be thinking, what can I publish? Well, any browser-based apps, essentially, you could publish out. You could make those available through the app proxy, but there are also some rich client-based apps that you could, and I say could very loosely here, because the application has to understand the Microsoft Authentication Library. So if you have an app that was built back in early 2000s and it hasn't really developed or evolved over time, chances are you're not going to be able to publish that out. So there is a big caveat there, is we are dependent on what the app provider has integrated into their app, or the app vendor has integrated into their app. But we could also publish apps via remote desktop gateway. So if we had an RDS solution in-house, we could make that app gateway, or that remote desktop gateway, available through app proxy, so that we can apply all of our Azure AD security to the app, the remote desktop apps, as well as remote desktops themselves. So question is, I'll pause right there. Any questions on what we've talked about so far? Okay. So let's first start off by looking at, let me pull up my demo environment here. All right. Yep. Close out some of the things on my workstation. All right. So the first thing to do is setting up single sign-on. How do we enable that? Well, I have a server here that is a domain controller, but it's also running my Azure AD Connect, and that's not necessarily a supported configuration unless you're in a demo environment or a lab environment. But directory, or AD Seamless Single Sign-On is configured through Azure AD Connect. When you go through the configuration, most of you probably already have this enabled, but I'll go through it anyways. If you don't have it enabled, if you come into the Connect, have the change user sign-in, click next on that. Of course, you have to authenticate. I have to remember my lab credentials. 1 second. And I apparently closed out of the browser that I had my credentials. Give me 1 second. Sorry about this. I got to log in and find my demo credentials. Okay, there we go. So in Directory Connect, we have the option to enable seamless single sign-on, and it's just a checkbox, really. It's this checkbox, this checkbox right down here. But what happens when we check that box? Well, when you step through the process, and it's not the full install process here, but as you step through the install process, if you checked that box, or if you're checking this for the first time, when you click next, it's going to prompt you for credentials. It's going to ask for credentials for the on-premise Active Directory environment, because what it's going to do is it is going to create a computer object. So open up directory users and computers here. It creates this Azure AD SS OACC, very long computer name, but it creates this computer object here. And what that is intended for is how the authentication process happens in the backend. So when I open up my browser on my workstation and I go to portal.office.com, what my browser, what Azure is going to respond back to me is say, hey, you know what? I'm going to run some JavaScript in your browser to go try to get a Kerberos ticket from on-premise AD. And what your computer will do is reach out to Active Directory and try to get a Kerberos ticket for this computer object. Within that ticket, it will also have your individual user identity. So your computer gets that Kerberos ticket from Active Directory. It sends that up to Azure. Azure knows how to decrypt that Kerberos ticket because during the setup, when we created this computer object here, it securely synchronized the computer object's Kerberos decryption key up to Azure. So Azure decrypts that Kerberos ticket that validates that you could obtain a Kerberos ticket from local Active Directory for that computer object. But two, it then sees the user identity within that ticket. And then it responds back and says, okay, I know who you are. You could authenticate to on-premise Active Directory. I'll issue you a challenge to get a authentication token from Azure AD. And essentially, Azure AD just gives you that token for your user authentication, all without the user having to do anything. Now, there might be some degree of interaction that's required, but that might just be you typing in your username into your browser. You don't have to type your password, but if your browser is not picking up your currently logged in Windows credentials, if your machine is not Azure AD joined, you might not know Windows user login that I can leverage to pre-populate that user field in the web browser. So it might prompt you for a username, but that's dependent on how we have or how you have your machine set up. There is another item here that we have to make sure, and this is my Windows 10 client device. There is another thing that we have to make sure, and we can push this out via group policy, but we have to configure a specific setting in the internet settings on each machine. So if I type in the iNet control panel, so even if you switch to Edge, if you've upgraded to Edge, we used to go into Edge or Internet Explorer. Actually, I think Internet Explorer is still here. Maybe I can pull that up. Whoops, I clicked the wrong thing. So yeah, in Internet Explorer, we're used to going over to gear setting here and going into internet options and going through all the settings that way. Same thing, similar with Edge, but you can get there by going to that. Oh, I got too many windows open. The iNet CPL is the Internet Control Panel settings. And again, we can push this out through group policy or even Intune or Endpoint Manager now. But what we want to do is add a specific site to the local intranet. So if you click on the sites, select local intranet, sites advanced, we need to add in a specific site here called HTTPS, autologon.microsoft Azure AD-SSO.com. Now, the reason this is necessary is because when your machine detects that this is a local site, it knows that it can perform Kerberos authentication. If it's not listed here, Microsoft is going to respond back or redirect you to this autologon.microsoft Azure AD-SSO.com to try to start that single sign-on process, and your machine is going to treat it like an external website. And then by default, it's going to say, hey, I'm not going to perform Kerberos authentication for an external website because that doesn't make sense. But when we add that into the local intranet, that enables that JavaScript that runs within the browser to perform that Kerberos authentication. So once that's in place, now I can come into my browser, portal.office.com, and hopefully I don't have to log out, log back in for this to work. All right, so it's detected that I've got a user. That's because my machine is enrolled, but I didn't have to enter in any password. So even if I come in here and say, You know what? Come on, sign out if it'll respond to me. So when I do this, I should be signed out of all my browsers, right? Or at least this browser session. So if I repeat that, well, you saw there, it kind of loaded on the back end by itself. I clicked client, sign out, and it started to sign me back in automatically because my single sign-on is in place. Let me try that one more time. Maybe you guys can catch it here. I'm gonna come up here. Whoops. Come up here, say sign out of the browser or the session. We'll give it a second here. And when it does the redirection, it should, yeah. Oh, maybe it didn't. It looked like it was going to try to. But if I go back portal.office.com, no prompt for a password, even though I signed out of the browser, because single sign-on is occurring in the background. Now, if I had other applications that I've published, they would show up here. If I go to my all apps, I'm actually jumping ahead of myself. I have Dropbox for business setup. I could click Dropbox, and that would go ahead and sign me in automatically to Dropbox. But I'm not going to jump there yet because I want to first go through how we work with Gallery apps and adding in a new enterprise application for single sign-on. So, any questions on that before I go on? Okay. So let me open up Azure AD. So let's say we do want to integrate a third-party SaaS app. What's the first thing that we need to do? Well, if it is in the gallery, it's a lot easier. And there is some lag when you do some of these configurations. So I've pre-configured Dropbox so I can show what that looks like. But if we wanted to add a new application, we could come in here to Enterprise Applications, click on that. And then up at the top, we have New Application. By clicking there, we're defaulting to the gallery. So you see some cloud platform apps that we can select from. Here's some third-party SaaS apps that are available from the gallery. But if we wanted to search and find something specifically, so if I wanted to do just Box itself, type that in and I can find here, look, Box is a pre-integrated application. Apparently a ton of other apps here that also have Box in the name. But to add this app, I'll go ahead and click on Box here. The name in is how it shows up in my Azure AD directory. So if I wanted to rename this, I could. Not really a huge need to do that, but I'll go ahead and click Create. And all that is doing is creating an app registration within Azure AD for me. If I look at, I'm in Enterprise Applications, I'll come back here, but if I go back to my Azure AD instance and look at app registrations now, in all applications, there's Box showing up here. And that was just added in because I added it through the gallery. But we don't have to worry too much about the app registration. This is if we really wanted to use this as an API to enable other things to happen outside of Box itself, because we could assign permissions and client secrets here. So if we wanted to connect to it via the Graph API, we could do that if we wanted to. But we're not going to worry about that because we do intend this to be used just by Box. So I'm going to go back to my enterprise applications, open up Box. And by default, no one is assigned to this application, which means no one really sees this. Going back to my my desktop here, coming up to my waffle, I don't see Box, even if I refresh the screen. I don't see it, even though it's been added to my tenant under my all apps. Whoops, did I go too far? Yeah, so all apps here. I don't see Box because I'm not assigned to it. So you first have to add users to the application. So I'm going to go ahead and add my test user here, who is Irvin. And you can see here object type user. Based on whether the app has, whoops, jumped out where I wanted to be. Based on whether the app has different roles, you can select different roles for the user when you add them in there. So if there's a admin role to the app, you could do that. But first, we do have to add a user. You could add a group in here, and hopefully this works fast enough. I refresh here. I might have to wait a little bit, but I should see Box now show up in my all apps. To set up single sign-on though, just because we've added Box to our Azure AD tenant doesn't mean that it's doing anything with Box. It might just pop up a little My Apps icon if I don't do any additional configuration, but I really want users to be able to single sign on into Box. So we have to set up at least one thing, and that's the single sign-on settings. The other thing is the provisioning. So let me jump into single sign-on first. And most apps here will use SAML. And what's really cool is Microsoft has guides for almost all of the apps that they have in their gallery. So if you click on this link for Read the Configuration Guide, it takes me straight to the link for Microsoft on how to enable single sign-on with Box. So if I scroll through this link, this article here, it's telling me exactly what I need to configure for all the different values to establish single sign-on, but also what I need to do, what I need to do with Box then to set up single sign-on. So in here, there's specific URLs. So I'll go back up, I'll scroll up here in the help article. You can see I need to know what my sign-on URL, but it's going to be in this format. I need to create an account, an enterprise account with Box. That's going to give me a unique subdomain for authentication. The reply URL is for the SAML authentication here, but they're giving me that as well. So when I go to configure it, I really click edit and just type in the values that that article is telling me to type in. What gets generated is a certificate that we then upload into Box. But you know, some of the settings when I was trying to set this up with Box originally, it did take a little while for it to go through. So I did pre-configure Dropbox instead so that I could show you these settings here. So let me jump into Dropbox. Dropbox Enterprise. There we go, Dropbox Business. So here I've already set up the single sign-on settings. But again, using the link here, the configuration guide, it told me how to go about and get these values that I need for single sign-on. And right here, this is my test Dropbox account ID. So that was the unique thing about my Dropbox account that I had to look up, but you can get that by creating a test Dropbox account and find that value pretty easily. You can see here now that I do have the SAML certificate now populated. So one of the processes that I had to follow, and let me see if I go to Dropbox. Now it's not single signing me in right now because my admin account is not a member. And I gotta remember my admin username this way. Oh, I guess I do have single sign-on enabled, but I don't have that user assigned. That's awesome. Well, let me do this. I will come back in here and add my administrative account. Hopefully this goes through fast enough. Okay. So that's jumping a little bit ahead of where I wanted to be, but that was a single sign-on experience to Dropbox. But in Dropbox, in here in the admin console in Dropbox, I had to set up, I can remember where I do all the settings here for single sign-on. I had to set up the single sign-on within Dropbox itself. So here it's pretty straightforward in Dropbox. Some of the other third-party SaaS apps aren't as straightforward, but it's asking me for who's my identity provider. And if I look back into my properties on my, I'm sorry, not the properties, my single sign-on for Dropbox, Microsoft is providing me those details. Oh, nope, they changed this, I'm sorry. They want you to install this extension now, which automates some of this, but if you had to manually set it up, here are the URLs that I have to provide to Dropbox to enable SAML single sign-on within Dropbox. So if I go back here, you'll see the identity provider sign-in URL, the sign out URL, and then here's that certificate. So I have links here. If I click on these links, it just gives me the option to upload the cert, gives me the option to type in the URL. I don't have to change those right now, But Microsoft has given me all that information. So here's the cert. I go to download the certificate. It gives me the .cer file. I upload that into Dropbox. So that's how simple single sign-on can be. But if you don't have users in Dropbox, how can you single sign on to it, right? So if I come back here and I look at my members in Dropbox, I have my administrative account and I have my Irvin account, but let's say I have another user here. Let's see, I'll put Adele Vance in here. So I've assigned Adele to this application in Azure AD, but that doesn't automatically create her here in Dropbox. So if she opens up the application, she's going to get a single sign-on prompt, and Dropbox is not going to know how to authenticate her because it's going to try to authenticate a user that doesn't exist in Dropbox. So that's where we can enable provisioning. So in my Dropbox configuration in Azure AD, I have this provisioning tab. And what we can do here is set up provisioning so that Microsoft leverages the APIs it already knows about Dropbox. I give it my admin credentials to authenticate to Dropbox so it knows how to establish that connection. But then I create mappings, and these are just the defaults. This is what Azure AD created on its own, saying, go ahead and provision users and groups that are assigned to the applications. And if we click in here, there should be some attribute mappings here. So display name goes to the Dropbox display name. This is kind of pulling in some of that, I don't want to call it MIM, but some of the identity synchronization feel from Microsoft Identity Manager, or even what you see on the synchronization service in Directory Connect. We're just doing mappings from attributes, and Azure AD is going to go ahead and push out those mappings to Dropbox. So I'm not going to try to wait for it to come back in here. I can come in and say provision on demand. I want to create a new user here, Adele. She is just been assigned to the application, but I'm going to click provision. And the reason I'm doing the provision on demand is I just don't want to wait for my cycles in the background. So as you can see here, it is successfully provisioned. But here I have provision and running automatically. So eventually Azure will see that new user being assigned into the groups or the user and try to provision Adele automatically. I just didn't want to wait for that. So now this was a little funky when I tried it yesterday, but let's see what it shows up here. So now you can see I have one member that is pending. And if I look here, it is now Adele as that person who's been invited. So what Adele has received is an email to her email address provided here, which is also her username, that she has to go into email and accept the invitation first. So she can't just hit single sign-on or Dropbox and log in directly to Dropbox because she hasn't accepted the invite via her email. So it hasn't validated her account. Once she logs into her email, accepts that link, she then becomes a standard member in here, and then she can single sign on. So there's a little bit of an extra step, at least with Dropbox. That might not be the same process for every application that's integrated for single sign-on or provisioning. That's just how Dropbox happens to occur. But if I come back to my test user, Irvin here, who has been already provisioned, you can see here I do have Dropbox listed. Just curious if Box will show up now since I did add it. There we go. So you can see Box is now showing up. And that icon should come through. There it is. Because he was added to Box as a enterprise application in Azure AD, I'm going to go ahead and click on Dropbox for Business. I'm logged into portal.office using my Azure AD credentials in here. I'm prompted, do you want to sign on? I don't have to type my username or anything, just click continue. And I'm logged into Dropbox as my Irvin test user. So that's the end user experience, what they would see after you enable single sign-on and provisioning for Azure AD applications. Before I move on, any questions on that? Check the chat real quick. If my mouse, lost my mouse, there it is. I don't see any questions in the chat either, so I'll go ahead and move on. So now let's look at what do we want to do when we want to publish an on-premise application. So on my server here, I've got a very basic website set up. Close out of these windows here. I installed IIS on this server. So if I just go to, come on. So if I just go to the root directory of my website here, you can see I've customized the default Internet Information Services, or IIS, splash screen to say CSP demo website, whoops, up the top right here. And I've customized the banner or the title on the tab here. It says CSP demo website. But this is just a website sitting on my VM. Now, I'm sitting at home right now running this VM in Workstation. So to make this publicly accessible, I would have to create a rule on my firewall that allows inbound web traffic. I would have to create a NAT rule to redirect it to my laptop. And then on my laptop, I would have to have a NAT rule that then redirects it to my VM. And I'm not going through all that process to make my website publicly available. But I don't have to go through all of that process. I can use the Azure AD App Proxy. To do the app proxy, let me close out some tabs here. Okay. I'm going to go back to Enterprise Applications in Azure AD. We have the tab here for App Proxy. You can download the connector service. So it's a small, lightweight app. You pretty much come in here and download it. I've already got it installed. And there's really, it's one of those click next installations done. The only thing it will do is prompt you for credentials, so it knows how to associate to the correct tenant. So if I typed in my Improving username into that installation, it would connect to Improving, assuming that my Improving account had rights to do so. So the connector is generic. Just because I'm downloading it from my tenant, if I go into Azure AD and go to App Proxy and I download it here, this downloader is nothing customized to my tenant. It really depends on how I log into the install, and that pops up the first time you install the connector onto the server. So the connector can be installed anywhere. I've got it on the same server running my website just because I didn't want to spin up several unnecessary VMs. But you typically don't have the connector on the same server as your website. We can actually deploy several instances of this connector to make it highly available as well. Also, if you had a web app that was distributed across web servers geographically, some in East US, some in West US, in your on-premise data centers in those locations, you could have the app proxy geo load balance as well. So if a user is logging in from California, the app proxy will automatically know, hey, redirect that to the Western US data center. So there's some cool things you can do with like geo awareness when it comes to load balancing, but I'm just going to focus on a very simple deployment, which is we have a connector installed on this IIS server. So once we have it installed, how do we use it? So connector doesn't do anything other than just establish that outbound HTTPS session to Azure AD. To make an application accessible, again, I come into Enterprise Applications, All Apps, I'll click on New App. And here you can see I have an on-premise application. So if I click on Add an on-premise application, I'm going to go through the setup of creating a new enterprise app, but I'm going to associate it to my app proxy connector. So I'm going to just say this is my test or CSP demo website. What's the internal URL? So if I was sitting on-prem, how could I reach this? I can't really say HTTP localhost. Actually, I think in this case, I probably could because the connector is running on the same server. But this is where you would type in your internal URL. So I'm going to give it the name of my server. And I have to give it, I'm going to give it the fully qualified name. Let me get my internal domain name. I'll copy and paste it. I don't want to type it all out. So I made my internal domain name the same as my tenant domain. So that would be the internal URL. If I was sitting on-prem, I would type that into my browser, and that's how I would reach the application or the website. By default, Microsoft is going to assign us a name based on what we give the app up here. but also assign it to this tenant.msappproxy.net URL. So Microsoft owns all of these. If I had a custom domain set up within my tenant, I don't in my demo here, but if I had improven.com set up as a custom domain in my tenant, I would have that as a selectable option as well. So I could have CSP demo website.improven.com if I wanted to, but I'm just going to let it default to the msappproxy.net because Microsoft manages that DNS namespace. So you can see here, here's the external URL to my web app. This is what users would go to. Again, if I had my custom domain, it would be a lot easier because it would say CSP demo website.improven.com, but I'm just selecting what Microsoft has. What we would do in our DNS is create a CNAME record that essentially points CSP demo website.improven.com to this. Or if we wanted to, no, I think you do have to do a CNAME. So that way, when users go in CSP demo website.improven.com, they're sitting outside of our internal network. They hit public DNS. Our public DNS namespace says, hey, here's a CNAME. It points back to the CSP demo website tenant.msappproxy.net. They go then to hit Azure. That's going to be our web endpoint for our app. Now I have this option here for how do we want to authenticate. If the app does authentication itself, so if my website in IIS I configured user authentication, I could use the authentication directly via the website. And all this is doing is now passing through that session directly to my internal website. It's not doing any kind of pre-authentication. Doesn't really buy me a whole lot of value there because what I want to do is I want to make sure that users are authenticated to Azure AD. That's where all my cloud security controls are, right? So if I wanted to apply multi-factor authentication, if I wanted to make sure they're coming from a trusted device, I want to make sure I'm using pre-authentication to Azure AD. And then this is where I define what app proxy. Now it's in a connector group. I just have my one app proxy that sits in the default group. But I can leave pretty much everything else the same here. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down. I think there's a save. Nope. Okay. I'll just hit add at the top. This might take a second.
Chris, you do have one question in the chat asking if you have an example of the email message that the end user would receive when they're invited.
I might, and that's going to be not based on Azure AD. That's going to be based on the service. So in here, this example, I connected to Dropbox. If I go to my user and Outlook, so the message, the invite was generated from Dropbox, not from Azure AD. So I think I may have actually deleted the original invite. Let me see. Yeah. So these are all Dropbox emails, right? So I got the invitation saying, whoops. So here's the original invitation. Join your CSP demo teammates on Dropbox. That was the name of my team in Dropbox down here, CSP demo. This is the invite that Dropbox created. If you can see here at the very bottom, I know it's probably really small in the Teams screen sharing. You can see the URL is www.dropbox.com and then a unique GUID after that. So this invite is from Dropbox, not Azure AD. Okay. Hopefully that answers, or at least provides some additional value there, that Azure AD, you're not going to receive a message from Azure just because you've been added as a member of the group. And then provisioning is going to be dependent on the third-party app that you are integrating. If it requires an invite to be approved first, that invite will be generated by that third-party service.
Cool. Ken says that answered his question. Great question, Ken.
Cool.
Thank you.
All right, so I've gone through, I've added my app. So if I come back to my apps here, I might have to refresh this. Let me refresh the screen. Come on. I might have to book it through this a little bit faster because there's a little bit more I wanted to go over. In all apps, I should see my CSP demo website. I have to do the same thing here. I have to come in and I have to assign a user. If I don't assign users, then they don't see that. Oops, Irvin. assign him. Okay. So he should have that now. If I go back to Irvin here, and I know I'm on the same network, so it's probably not as great of a demo here. But if I go back to my apps, all apps, hopefully this shows up quick enough. If not, might come back and try to show it. So CSP demo website shows up. I click there. If you trace the URL happening up here at the top, you can see it's trying to log me in. Check in Azure AD. Not sure why it's taking as long as it is. Awesome. Oh, there we go. So you can look at the URL. I'm hitting a public URL here, the appproxy.net. I don't own that, so that is reaching out to the internet. So I'm kind of going out to come back in right now in my demo, but you can see here my customized, whoops, I think I clicked the URL or the image. My customized splash page here does have my CSP demo website listed. So now that application is accessible outside of my lab environment. And I had to do nothing for firewall rules or anything like that. The app proxy is allowing that inbound communication. All right. Oh, the other thing is now that it's an enterprise app, if I wanted to create conditional access policy, I'm not going to go through the setup of conditional access here. Come on. I now have that app available to me if I wanted to create a policy and assign it to just my demo website. I can say select apps, and you can see here CSP demo website. So if it was an HR application or something like that, I could put a lot more security around it versus if you're just accessing email. So I can now scope policies specifically to that application. Same thing with Dropbox for Business. I could do the same thing because that is now a enterprise application within my tenant. Okay. All right, let me jump back to here. So we talked about single sign-on. We talked about adding enterprise apps via the gallery, doing some on-premise. I can't really show you the custom developed apps because I don't have an app that I'm developing. And I'm not well versed enough on the development side to know how to integrate the Microsoft Authentication Library. But let's see what else we can do outside of Azure AD App Proxy and enterprise applications. The next thing that we have available to us is what can we do on the endpoints? Now, there's two options here. There is Windows Defender Application Control. This used to be, I can't remember the name of it. This used to be something else. It's very similar to App Locker if you're familiar with that. But essentially what Windows Defender Application Control does is it validates certain things about a installer or an application code file with Microsoft. So it's looking at code sign-in certificates. It's looking at the reputation of a known app with the Microsoft Intelligent Security Graph. It might be looking at the identity of the process that initiated the installer or the path from which the app is launched. So there's some metadata or some certain items about the app, unique identifiers about the app that Windows Defender Application Control looks at to say, hey, should this app run or not? The other option is Defender for Endpoint, or the new name for Defender ATP or Microsoft Defender ATP is now Defender for Endpoint. We can use custom indicators. So when we look at the custom indicators, we're essentially saying, hey, this file hash can't run, or this URL can't run on the endpoint. And then if we wanted to take that a step further, we could also integrate Cloud App Security. And I know I only have a few minutes left here, so I'm going to try to go through this really fast, so I apologize for that. But Cloud App Security, we have two means to control access. One is we can use conditional access, which calls Cloud App Security. Now, this only works for apps that have been integrated for conditional access and Cloud App Security. So not every third-party SaaS app out there will be able to leverage the conditional access approach. And that's when you go to conditional access, you create a policy, and the grant control is a session control, because that session control hands it off to MCAS. And then MCAS then performs all the access, whether you're allowed or not, or just blocked. The other item is MCAS generated custom indicators. And I think this will make sense here in a second when I show you how the custom indicators work. But if I mark an app as unsanctioned in MCAS, it pushes that down to Defender for Endpoint so that the endpoints know, hey, I'm not allowed to go to this website, and the browsers should be blocked from getting there. So let me try to go through the demo as quickly as I can. All right. Whoops. Trying to jump between screens here. Make sure I pull the right ones up. Okay. All right, so first thing we need to do is make sure that the environment is set up to accommodate what we want to do with it. So we talked, there's Defender for Endpoint, there's Cloud App Security. They don't just talk by themselves together. We have to make sure that that capability is enabled. So if we look at Defender ATP, we go to the settings, advanced features, a couple things we need to make sure are enabled. The main thing here is, where is it? First is Microsoft Cloud App Security. This needs to be enabled because this is how MCAS is going to push custom indicators down to Defender ATP or Defender for Endpoint so that we can block apps at the endpoint itself. So we need to have this enabled. On the MCAS side, you would think it would just be check one box. But on the MCAS side, we have to do something very similar. We have to come into the settings here, look down for Microsoft Defender for Endpoint under Cloud Discovery, and we have to check this box, block unsanctioned apps and Defender Endpoint, Defender for Endpoint. What this is going to do is it enables MCAS to say, hey, we marked this app as unsanctioned, push that down to Defender ATP, because in Defender ATP, we enabled our MCAS integration here. It's going to say, okay, yes, I will actually listen to what MCAS has to tell me and do what it says. So without those two features enabled, some of the stuff doesn't work. So let's first look at custom indicators, and that's in Defender ATP or Defender for Endpoint. I'm going to stumble on that quite a bit here. We want to create indicators. And here we have the option for file hashes, IP addresses, certificates, but what we're going to focus on is URLs and domains. And what I have listed here are some custom indicators. I created one for Google, and I pretty much just said, hey, Google is a bad domain for some reason. Anything google.com, I want to detect it, and I want to block it. So I create an alert, and I block that at the endpoint. So just because I create this custom indicator in Defender ATP doesn't mean that boom, immediately it's going to start working on the endpoint. It has to propagate down to all the endpoints, and that can take a couple of hours actually for that to go through. But I create a custom indicator and I'm giving it a domain. I can be as granular as I want here. Right now, I just said do google.com. But if I wanted this to go to play.google.com for the Play Store, if it was google.com/yada, yada, yada, I could pass it very specific URLs as well. But by doing this, I'm saying everything to Google shouldn't be allowed. If I look at MCAS, I can come in here into my Discover. I can look at the Cloud App Catalog, but if you had discovered apps, if you're using MCAS, you might have some more apps here than what I have listed. Well, good. So Dropbox did show up here. If I go ahead and check an app that's been discovered and I say, you know what, tag this as unsanctioned. It's going to prompt me, say, do you really want this to be blocked? This will update. So now it has the red circle there. In about 5 to 10 minutes, we will see in Defender new indicators. Let me jump back in here, being created in our custom indicators section. And you can see that for what I have for Salesforce, all this stuff here, Salesforce, lightning.com, visualforce.com, this is all Salesforce. I didn't manually create these, but you can see here it was created by Cloud App Security. The same thing with WordPress, created by Cloud App Security. And that is because if I look at Salesforce, oops, typing that in the wrong search. Let me just go to the cloud catalog. Okay. You can see here, Salesforce, I've already unsanctioned that app. Now, I don't have Salesforce proxied through MCAS. I don't have conditional access set up via, or I'll have conditional access policy set up for Salesforce specifically. I don't even think in my demo tenant here, if I look at my enterprise applications, it probably doesn't even show up as an enterprise application. Let's see here. Oh, okay, so Salesforce does show up, but WordPress doesn't show up here as an enterprise application. But yeah, I'm able to block that via MCAS, and that's just sending down those signals to the endpoint. So your endpoints have to be onboarded into Defender ATP. There's some other things that have to also be enabled on Defender ATP, specifically network protection. That is a configuration policy you can push down through Endpoint Manager, but you have to have network protection enabled for Defender for the endpoint to block this. And one thing, unfortunately, that I do not have working in my lab right now is being able to show you this, because I should not be able to go to google.com. Obviously, I can get there right now, but what you should see is if this is all propagated down correctly. Where is it? I might not see it here. Well, I thought I would be able to show you, but I don't see it. There's a test site that I could show you. I'm not seeing it in here. You should get a big red screen that says you're not allowed to get here from there. Unfortunately, I don't have that URL in front of me, but WordPress, the same thing. Unfortunately, in my lab, I don't have it working. I can get there, but I should get a big red screen right here instead of being able to get to WordPress. And that should be agnostic of what browser you're using, because the underlying tool that should be preventing me from getting there is Defender network protection, and that's running at the operating system level. It's looking at the network traffic itself. It's not looking at the browser, where the browser is going to. It's looking at the network traffic. So that's what we should see. Unfortunately, again, it's not working in my lab, but I know I am running up on time here. It's I think 1 till the hour. So I wanted to make sure, are there any questions? Anything that we've gone over? Any questions? Take that as a no. Well, I'll stick on for another couple of minutes. So if you do have a question, feel free to go ahead and ask. But our upcoming series, we are wrapping up our 2020 series. We do have the link shown here for our recordings for all of the previous sessions that we did conduct. Today we are talking about the app access. So our December session will be talking about security at the data level. That's where I'll be jumping into pretty granularly on Microsoft Information Protection or Azure Information Protection, and a lot of cool stuff that we can do there. So not to say that our cloud security controls don't mean anything, but how do we control data even after it leaves our physical possession? So that's some cool stuff we'll talk about next month in December, security at the data level. So as I said, I'll stick on for another couple minutes if there are any questions, but otherwise I appreciate you, everyone, for joining in and attending. I will be sending out a feedback link. So I do look at all of the feedback, and it's going to help us craft our 2021 webinar series. So please take a few minutes to fill that out when you do get it, because I will be asking for some suggestions or anything specific anyone wants to see as part of these webinars moving forward. So maybe it's something that benefits you directly, or something that you have planned for 2021 that you want to maybe get a little more information on before you dive into. So appreciate everyone's time, and thank you very much.